Medieval women possessed healing secrets that challenged church and crown alike. Welcome, weary wanderers, to Moonlit Chronicles, where the gentle whispers of history help ease you into peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey into shadows and candlelight, discovering the remarkable women who held life and death in their weathered hands. These weren't the queens and nobles you might expect, but rather the midwives, herbalists, and wise women who possessed knowledge so powerful that kingdoms both feared and desperately needed them. Before we begin our tale, dear listeners, if these stories bring you comfort in the quiet hours, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue sharing these forgotten whispers with fellow seekers of gentle knowledge. And stay with us until the end, for we'll discover why medieval women's healing secrets were so closely guarded that some would rather face accusations of witchcraft than reveal them. Now, settle in as we explore a world where a single woman might know the difference between a healing draught and a deadly poison, where birth and death danced together in candlelit chambers, and where wisdom passed from mother to daughter like precious heirlooms. In the year 1347, as the first whispers of plague began to drift across European trade routes, a woman named Marguerite bent over her grinding stone in a small cottage outside Rouen. The stellar role of women as healers during the Middle Ages has received some attention from medical historians, but remains little known or appreciated. Yet Marguerite represented thousands of women whose names history forgot, but whose knowledge kept entire communities alive. Her fingers, stained green from years of working with herbs, moved with practiced precision as she prepared willow bark powder, a remedy her grandmother had taught her for fever and pain. What Marguerite couldn't know in her pre-scientific world, was that she was preparing what we now recognize as a precursor to aspirin. But she did know, with the deep certainty that comes from generations of careful observation, that this particular bark would ease the suffering of the miller's wife, who had been laboring in childbirth for nearly 2 days. Women were often responsible for the health of their families, and therefore had to know how to use herbs to treat common illnesses. They also passed on their knowledge of herbal medicine to their daughters and granddaughters, creating a tradition of female healers. This transmission of knowledge wasn't casual. It was a sacred responsibility, passed down through what scholars now recognize as one of the most sophisticated medical traditions of the medieval world. The cottage where Marguerite worked was typical of countless others scattered across medieval Europe. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters like fragrant chandeliers. Chamomile for calming troubled minds, yarrow for wounds that wouldn't heal, nettle for the joint pain that plagued the elderly during harsh winters. Against one wall stood her pride, a collection of clay pots containing her most precious substances. Some held exotic spices obtained from traveling merchants. Cardamom for digestive ailments, cinnamon for circulation, pepper mixed with honey for coughs that threatened to become consumption. But it was her local knowledge that truly set Marguerite apart. She knew which mushrooms growing in the dark forest could stop bleeding instantly, and which could stop a heart just as quickly. She understood that the same plant, beautiful foxglove with its purple bell-shaped flowers, could strengthen a failing heart in tiny doses or kill in larger ones. This wasn't trial and error. This was knowledge refined over centuries, taught by mothers who had learned from their mothers, stretching back to times when Rome still ruled and Christianity was just taking root in northern lands. The medieval world was surprisingly international in its medical knowledge. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, a visionary Benedictine abbess, made significant contributions to medieval medicine and spirituality. Her holistic approach combined knowledge of herbs, stones, and foods with mystical insights, as documented in her medical text Causi et Curie. While Hildegard wrote from her monastery, ordinary women like Marguerite practiced similar holistic medicine in villages and towns, combining practical herbalism with spiritual practices that acknowledged the deep connection between body, mind, and spirit. What made these women so indispensable was their intimate knowledge of the female body and its mysteries. In an age when male physicians, if they could even be found, were forbidden by custom and often by law from examining women's bodies closely, female healers became the guardians of women's health. They understood the delicate timing of conception, the herbs that could ease difficult pregnancies, and the techniques that could save both mother and child during complicated births. Marguerite's expertise extended far beyond childbirth. She was what medieval society called a wise woman, or, in some regions, part of the cunning folk, including both men and women. Herbal folk healers whose knowledge was passed down through generations, or learned through exploration of the nearby field and forests. Her knowledge encompassed everything from treating broken bones to easing the passing of those whose time had come. She could tell by the color of someone's urine whether they suffered from kidney stones or diabetes, though she wouldn't have used those modern terms. She called it the honey sickness for the sweet smell it gave to urine. The relationship between these wise women and the established church was complex and often fraught. While Christianity had spread throughout Europe, many healing practices retained elements of older traditions. Marguerite might begin a healing session with a Christian prayer, but she also knew charms and incantations that had been whispered in her grandfather's time. She would make the sign of the cross over her medicines, but she also understood the importance of gathering certain herbs only under specific moon phases or at particular times of day. This blending of Christian and pre-Christian practices wasn't seen as contradictory by most people of the time. If God had created the plants with healing properties, wasn't it natural to use all knowledge, however ancient, to unlock those properties? The Church's position on such matters varied dramatically by region and time period, but generally, as long as healers acknowledged God as the ultimate source of healing power, their practices were tolerated and often encouraged. What set women healers apart from their male counterparts wasn't just their focus on female health, but their fundamentally different approach to medicine. While male physicians, trained in universities when they existed at all, relied heavily on ancient texts, primarily Greek and Roman sources filtered through Arabic translations, women healers relied on direct observation and hands-on experience. They were empiricists in the truest sense, developing their understanding through careful attention to what actually worked. This empirical approach led to some remarkably sophisticated understanding. Medieval wise women knew, for instance, that mold growing on bread could help heal infected wounds, anticipating the discovery of penicillin by centuries. They understood that certain plants were most potent when harvested at specific times, a knowledge that modern pharmacology has confirmed relates to the plant's chemical cycles. They knew which combinations of herbs worked synergistically, and which could be dangerous when mixed. Herbalists began exploring plants for their medicinal benefits as well as for farming purposes. They collected, grew, dried, stored, and illustrated plants, gaining expertise in identifying them and understanding their environments and uses. While many of these women couldn't read or write in the conventional sense, they possessed a sophisticated understanding of botanical classification and medicinal chemistry that wouldn't be formally acknowledged by academic medicine for centuries. The economic role of these healers was also crucial to medieval society. In a world where professional medical care was available only to the wealthy, and then only in larger towns, wise women provided essential health care to the vast majority of the population. They were often paid in goods rather than coin. A basket of eggs for delivering a baby, a sack of grain for curing a persistent cough, a bolt of cloth for successfully treating a fever. This barter system integrated them deeply into their community's economic life, while keeping their services accessible to even the poorest families. But perhaps most importantly, These women served as bridges between worlds, between the world of the living and the dying, between the natural and supernatural, between ancient wisdom and contemporary need. They were present at every major transition in human life: birth, coming of age, marriage, illness, and death. Their knowledge wasn't just medical, it was deeply social and spiritual, encompassing understanding of human nature that went far beyond the purely physical. As Marguerite finished preparing her willow bark powder and gathered her birthing supplies, clean linen, sharp knives blessed with prayers, oils for massage, and the precious ergot that could strengthen contractions if labor stalled, she embodied centuries of accumulated wisdom. She was preparing to do what women like her had done for countless generations: stand between life and death, armed with nothing but knowledge, experience, and the fierce determination to bring new life safely into the world. The candle flickered as she packed her worn leather bag, each item chosen for its proven effectiveness. Tomorrow, she would walk the muddy path to the miller's cottage, where a young woman struggled with the fundamental challenge of human existence. Marguerite would bring not just medicines, but the accumulated wisdom of grandmothers, the careful observations of generations of women who had stood at the threshold between life and death, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she carried in her hands the power to heal. While Marguerite practiced her healing arts in northern France, far to the south in the Italian peninsula, something remarkable was taking place. In the coastal city of Salerno, where Mediterranean breezes carried the scents of lemon groves and the promises of distant lands, the world's first medical school was flourishing, and women were not merely welcomed but celebrated as some of its most accomplished practitioners. Trotta was, in fact, a healer from Salerno, and is likely the author of some of the most influential medical texts of the medieval period. But Trotta, sometimes called Trotula, wasn't alone. The school of Salerno, established in the 9th century, represented a unique moment in medieval history when women could study, practice, and teach medicine alongside men, contributing to a body of medical knowledge that would influence healing practices across Europe for centuries. Imagine walking through the narrow streets of 12th century Salerno on a warm afternoon. The limestone buildings reflected the intense southern sun, and the air hummed with conversation in a dozen languages. Latin scholarly discourse mixing with Arabic medical terminology, Norman French administrative commands blending with local Italian dialects. Merchants from Constantinople brought exotic spices prized for their medicinal properties, while scholars from Cordoba shared texts that preserved Greek medical knowledge through Arabic translations. In this cosmopolitan atmosphere, a woman known to us as Trotta of Salerno moved between lecture halls and treatment rooms with the same authority as her male colleagues. She was, by all accounts, a master practitioner who specialized in what we would now call gynecology and obstetrics, but her knowledge extended far beyond women's health. Her writings reveal a sophisticated understanding of anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology that would be impressive in any age. What made Salerno unique wasn't just that women could practice medicine there. Women practiced medicine everywhere in medieval Europe. What was revolutionary was that women could do so with full scholarly recognition, contributing to written medical literature that would be copied, studied, and referenced for centuries. Her holistic approach combined knowledge of herbs, stones, and foods with mystical insights. But unlike many healers of her time, Trotta had access to a vast library of medical texts and the scholarly community necessary to refine and expand medical knowledge systematically. The Trotula, a collection of medical texts associated with Trotta and other female practitioners of Salerno, represents one of the most comprehensive approaches to women's health care in medieval literature. These texts covered everything from contraception and fertility treatments to surgical procedures and postpartum care. But they also revealed something profound about medieval women's medicine. It was holistic in ways that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. Consider, for instance, Trotta's approach to treating what she called suffocation of the womb, a condition we might now recognize as having psychological as well as physical components. Her treatment protocol included herbal medicines, dietary changes, physical exercise, aromatherapy, and what we might call counseling. She understood that a woman's reproductive health was intimately connected to her emotional state, her social circumstances, and her overall physical condition. This wasn't primitive thinking. It was sophisticated, integrated medicine that acknowledged the complexity of human health. The knowledge preserved in Salerno came from remarkably diverse sources. Greek texts by Hippocrates and Galen formed the classical foundation, but these had been preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. Jewish physicians contributed their own traditions of medical practice, while local Italian folk medicine provided practical knowledge about native plants and traditional remedies. Women practitioners like Trotta synthesized all of these traditions, creating an approach to medicine that was both scholarly and practical. What's particularly fascinating about the Salerno school was its attitude toward the female body. While much of medieval European culture treated women's bodies as mysterious, potentially dangerous, or shameful, the Salerno texts approached female anatomy and physiology with scientific curiosity and respect. The authors understood the menstrual cycle, recognized various gynecological conditions, and developed sophisticated treatments for fertility issues, difficult pregnancies, and childbirth complications. This scientific approach extended to their understanding of conception and contraception. The Salerno texts contain detailed descriptions of various contraceptive methods, from herbal preparations to barrier methods, and even discussed the optimal timing for conception. This knowledge was practical and non-judgmental. The authors seemed to understand that women needed to be able to control their fertility for both health and social reasons. But the influence of Salerno extended far beyond its immediate geographical boundaries. Medical texts produced there were copied by scribes and carried by traveling scholars throughout Europe. A manuscript containing Trotta's wisdom might find its way to a monastery in Ireland, where it would be translated and adapted for local use. Another copy might travel with a crusading knight to the Holy Land, where it would influence the practice of field medicine. The knowledge of Salerno's women healers thus spread throughout the medieval world, influencing countless practitioners who might never have heard Trotta's name, but who benefited from her insights. The teaching methods at Salerno were also innovative. Rather than relying solely on ancient texts, instructors emphasized direct observation and hands-on experience. Students, both male and female, learned anatomy through dissection, studied the effects of various medications through careful observation of patients, and developed diagnostic skills through supervised practice. This empirical approach to medical education wouldn't become standard in other European medical schools for centuries. Women students at Salerno learned not just the theoretical aspects of medicine, but also practical skills that were often gender-specific. They became experts in reading the subtle signs of pregnancy, understanding the progression of labor, and managing the complications that could arise during childbirth. But they also learned general medical skills, how to set broken bones, treat wounds, diagnose fevers, and prescribe medications for a wide range of conditions. The pharmaceutical knowledge developed at Salerno was particularly sophisticated. The school's practitioners had access to an incredible variety of medicinal substances through Salerno's position as a major Mediterranean trading port. They could obtain frankincense from Arabia, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, and dozens of other exotic substances prized for their healing properties. But they also made careful study of local plants, developing detailed understanding of European herbs, that could be cultivated in monastery gardens or gathered from nearby forests. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Salerno tradition was its integration of different healing modalities. A single treatment protocol might include herbal medications, dietary recommendations, physical therapy, aromatherapy, and spiritual practices. For instance, a woman suffering from what we might now call postpartum depression would receive herbs to balance her humors, dietary guidelines to restore her strength, gentle exercises to rebuild her physical condition, pleasant scents to lift her spirits, and prayers or blessings to address her spiritual needs. The practical impact of this integrated approach was remarkable. The maternal mortality rates in areas influenced by Salerno's practices appear to have been significantly lower than in regions relying on less sophisticated medical care. The school's emphasis on cleanliness, proper nutrition, and careful monitoring of patients contributed to better outcomes for both routine and complicated cases. But perhaps most importantly, the School of Salerno represented a brief historical moment when women's medical knowledge was valued, preserved, and transmitted through formal educational channels. The texts produced there documented not just theoretical knowledge, but practical wisdom that had been developed through generations of women's healing practice. They preserved understanding of the female body that might otherwise have been lost, and they did so in a format that could be studied, copied, and refined by future generations of healers. The decline of women's participation in formal medical education, which began in the later medieval period and continued through the early modern era, makes the Salerno tradition even more remarkable. For several centuries, in this one place, women's medical knowledge was treated with the same respect accorded to male practitioners. Their contributions were documented, their innovations were celebrated, and their expertise was sought by patients from across Europe. As evening fell over the bay of Salerno, and the last students made their way home from the lecture halls, the knowledge they had gained would travel with them to distant lands. A young woman who had studied gynecology with Trotta's successors might establish her own practice in Sicily, bringing sophisticated understanding of women's health to communities that had never had access to such expertise. A male student who had learned pharmaceutical preparation from a female instructor might carry that knowledge back to England, where it would influence the practice of monastery physicians for generations. The legacy of Salerno's women healers extended far beyond their immediate historical moment. Their texts continued to be copied and studied long after the school itself had declined. Their integrated approach to medicine anticipated many developments in modern healthcare, while their respect for women's bodies and women's health concerns provided a model that wouldn't be matched in formal medical education for centuries. In the quiet corners of Salerno's ancient medical school, where moonlight fell across tables still bearing the faint stains of centuries-old experiments, the wisdom of these remarkable women seemed to linger. They had proven that women could contribute to medical knowledge at the highest levels, that empirical observation could enhance theoretical understanding, and that the best medicine addressed not just physical symptoms, but the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Deep in the forests of medieval Europe, where ancient oaks whispered secrets older than Christianity, and morning mist clung to moss-covered stones, women moved like shadows between the trees. They carried woven baskets and small, sharp knives, but their true tools were their eyes, trained through generations to recognize the subtle differences between healing and harm, between life and death, growing silently in the undergrowth. These were the plant-wise women, the keepers of what we might call the greatest pharmaceutical knowledge of their age. While university-trained physicians relied heavily on theoretical knowledge derived from ancient texts, these practitioners developed their understanding through direct, intimate relationship with the living world around them. In the Middle Ages, the folk healers, usually wise women, who had learned the secrets of which herbs, flowers, trees and plants had the power to heal and ward off evil influences, passed them down, usually just before death, to the next generation. Consider Mathilde, a wise woman living in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, sometime in the late 14th century. Her knowledge of plants was encyclopedic in ways that would astonish modern botanists. She could identify over 300 different species by sight, smell, and even taste. More importantly, she understood their properties, their interactions, their optimal harvesting times, and their proper preparation methods. This wasn't academic knowledge. It was living wisdom, refined through generations of careful observation and practical application. Mathilde's herb garden occupied a carefully chosen spot behind her cottage, where it received morning sunlight, but was protected from harsh afternoon heat by a grove of elderberry trees. The garden's layout followed principles that were part botanical science, part folk wisdom, and part what modern practitioners might call companion planting. Healing herbs were grouped not just by their medical properties, but by their growing requirements and their beneficial effects on each other. Near the cottage door grew the herbs she used most frequently: chamomile for its calming properties, calendula for wound healing, sage for digestive troubles, and thyme for respiratory ailments. These were her daily medicines, the plants she reached for to treat the common complaints that brought neighbors to her door. But deeper in the garden, in carefully tended plots, grew more specialized plants, dangerous allies that required expert knowledge to use safely. The foxglove section was clearly marked with carved wooden stakes, not because Mathilde couldn't identify these beautiful purple flowers, but as a warning to others who might visit her garden. She understood that foxglove could strengthen a failing heart or stop it entirely, depending on the dose. The same plants that could save the elderly blacksmith's life when his heart began to flutter irregularly could kill a child who ate the attractive flowers. This dual nature of many healing plants, their capacity to heal or harm depending on preparation and dosage, was fundamental to the herbalist's art. Mathilde's understanding of plant chemistry, though she wouldn't have used that term, was remarkably sophisticated. She knew that willow bark was most potent when harvested in early spring, just as the sap began to rise. Modern analysis shows this is when salicin content peaks. She understood that certain plants were most effective when used fresh, while others needed to be dried, fermented, or processed in specific ways to develop their full therapeutic potential. The seasonal rhythm of plant gathering was as complex as any academic calendar. Spring brought the first tender leaves of nettle, rich in vitamins after winter's scarcity. Early summer yielded the flowers of elder and hawthorn, while late summer provided the seeds and berries that would sustain her medicinal practice through the long winter months. Autumn was the time for root gathering, when the plant's energy had returned to its underground parts, concentrating the active compounds that made her treatments effective. But Mathilde's knowledge extended far beyond simple plant identification and harvesting. She understood complex preparations that anticipated many principles of modern pharmacology. Her tinctures, made by soaking plant materials in wine or distilled spirits, extracted active compounds in ways that made them more concentrated and longer lasting. Her decoctions carefully combined multiple plants whose effects were synergistic, each enhancing the other's therapeutic properties while minimizing unwanted side effects. One of her most prized preparations was a sleep remedy that combined valerian root, chamomile flowers, and lemon balm leaves in specific proportions. The valerian provided the primary sedative effect, while chamomile added gentle relaxation and digestive support. The lemon balm contributed a subtle mood-lifting quality that prevented the grogginess that could result from valerian alone. Modern pharmacological analysis would confirm that this combination works through multiple neurotransmitter pathways, creating a more balanced and effective sleep aid than any single plant could provide. The transmission of this botanical knowledge was a process of extraordinary depth and complexity. Many of these such healers were illiterate, but their knowledge was preserved through methods that were arguably more reliable than written texts. A mother teaching her daughter the herbalist's art would spend years demonstrating proper plant identification, walking forest paths in different seasons, explaining the subtle signs that indicated peak potency, and describing the complex interactions between different preparations. This oral tradition included not just factual information, but also the accumulated wisdom of generations. A young herbalist might learn that certain plants should only be gathered during specific moon phases, knowledge that modern agricultural science is beginning to validate, as plant metabolism does indeed vary with lunar cycles. She would learn traditional prayers or charms that accompanied the gathering and preparation of medicines, rituals that served partly as memory aids and partly as methods for maintaining the careful attention that safe practice required. The economic importance of this botanical knowledge cannot be overstated. In a world where professional medical care was largely unavailable to ordinary people, plant-based medicines represented the primary healthcare system for the vast majority of the population. A skilled herbalist like Mathilde might provide medical care for dozens of families, treating everything from childhood fevers to elderly joint pain, from difficult pregnancies to infected wounds. The range of conditions that could be effectively treated with plant medicines was remarkable. Digestive problems, which were common in an age of uncertain food safety, could be addressed with a sophisticated pharmacopoeia of carminative, antispasmodic, and anti-inflammatory plants. Respiratory ailments, particularly dangerous in the cold, damp conditions of northern European winters, responded to expectorants, bronchodilators, and immune-supporting herbs. Skin conditions, wounds, and infections could be treated with antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and wound-healing plants that were often more effective than any alternatives available. But perhaps most importantly, medieval herbalists understood the psychological and spiritual dimensions of healing in ways that purely physical medicine often missed. Mathilde knew that a person's emotional state profoundly affected their ability to heal, and her treatments typically included plants that supported mental and emotional well-being alongside those that addressed physical symptoms. A patient suffering from what we might now call depression would receive herbs that supported nervous system function, improved sleep quality, and lifted mood, all while addressing any underlying physical imbalances that might be contributing to their distress. The spiritual aspects of plant medicine were seamlessly integrated with practical applications. Many herbalists believed that plants had their own spiritual essence or personality, and that effective healing required not just correct identification and preparation, but also appropriate relationship with the plant spirits. This wasn't superstition. It was a sophisticated understanding of the healing process that acknowledged the importance of intention, attention, and respect in therapeutic practice. The gathering of plants was often accompanied by specific rituals or prayers that served multiple functions. On a practical level, these rituals ensured that the herbalist was in the proper state of mind to make accurate identifications and careful preparations. On a psychological level, they reinforced the sacred nature of the healing work and the responsibility that came with knowledge of life and death. On a spiritual level, they expressed gratitude to the natural world that provided these healing gifts. The storage and preservation of plant medicines required knowledge that was part chemistry, part engineering, and part artistry. Mathilde's cottage contained dozens of clay jars, wooden boxes, and hanging bundles, each containing different preparations at various stages of development. Some herbs needed to be kept completely dry to prevent mold and preserve potency. Others were stored in oils or alcohol to maintain their active compounds. Still others were prepared as fresh poultices that needed to be made new for each use. The labeling system for these preparations was often ingenious, using symbols, colors, or tactile markers that could be recognized even in dim light or by those who couldn't read conventional text. A particular type of knot in the string, tying an herb bundle, might indicate its potency or intended use. The shape of a jar or the texture of its surface might identify its contents to experienced hands. These systems ensured that even in emergency situations, often at night or in stressful circumstances, the right medicine could be quickly identified and prepared. The interaction between formal medical practice and folk herbalism was complex and varied by region and time period. In some areas, university-trained physicians worked cooperatively with local herbalists, recognizing that their theoretical knowledge could be enhanced by the practical experience of plant-wise women. In other regions, competition and suspicion dominated the relationship, with formally trained physicians dismissing herbal medicine as primitive superstition while secretly relying on its effectiveness. What's remarkable is how often medieval herbal knowledge anticipated modern pharmaceutical discoveries. The use of willow bark for pain and fever preceded the development of aspirin by centuries. The application of moldy bread to infected wounds foreshadowed the discovery of penicillin. The use of foxglove for heart conditions preceded the development of digoxin, a medication still used in modern cardiac care. The herbalist's understanding of dose-response relationships, drug interactions, and therapeutic windows was often more sophisticated than that of their university-trained contemporaries. As winter settled over Matilda's mountain valley, and the last of the year's harvest was safely stored away, she would begin the season's teaching. Young women from neighboring villages would come to learn the basics of plant medicine, how to recognize and prepare the most common remedies, how to treat simple ailments, how to know when a condition was beyond their skills and required more experienced intervention. In the pre-dawn darkness of a February morning in 1398, Agnes the midwife made her way through the narrow streets of York, her heavy cloak pulled tight against the bitter wind. Her leather satchel, worn smooth by decades of use, contained the tools of her sacred trade. Sharp knives blessed by the parish priest, lengths of clean linen, bottles of ergot and other powerful herbs, and most importantly, the accumulated wisdom of 30 years spent at the threshold between life and death. The medieval midwife occupied a position unlike any other in society. She was simultaneously revered and feared, trusted with the most intimate moments of human existence, yet often suspected of possessing knowledge that bordered on the supernatural. Agnes represented thousands of women across medieval Europe, who held in their experienced hands the difference between successful births and tragic losses, between living mothers and grieving families. The call that brought Agnes from her warm bed came from the wool merchant's house, where his young wife had been laboring since the previous evening. This would be the woman's third child, but as Agnes well knew, experience in childbirth guaranteed nothing. Each birth was its own journey into uncertainty, requiring all of her skills, and sometimes more than a little luck to bring both mother and child safely through. As Agnes climbed the wooden stairs to the birthing chamber, she carried with her not just medical knowledge, but a deep understanding of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of birth. She knew that a woman's emotional state could profoundly affect the progress of her labor, that fear could slow contractions while confidence could speed them. Her very presence, calm, experienced, radiating quiet competence, often provided as much healing as any herb or technique. The birthing chamber had been prepared according to traditions that were part practical medicine, part spiritual protection. The room was warm and dimly lit, with windows covered to provide privacy and concentrate the mother's attention inward. Sacred objects, a crucifix, holy water, perhaps a relic of Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, provided spiritual comfort and divine protection. Clean linens and basins of warm water stood ready for the practical work ahead. Agnes's first task was always assessment. She examined the laboring woman with hands that could read the story of the birth through touch. The position of the baby, the strength and frequency of contractions, the mother's vital signs. All of this information flowed through her experienced fingers. Her diagnostic skills, developed through decades of practice, often rivaled those of university-trained physicians who had far less hands-on experience with actual patients. The knowledge that guided Agnes's practice came from multiple sources. Medieval midwifery texts, like those associated with Trotula of Salerno, provided theoretical framework, but these written sources were often supplemented and sometimes contradicted by practical knowledge passed down through generations of practicing midwives. Agnes had learned her craft from an older midwife who had attended her own birth, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back through centuries. This transmitted knowledge included not just technical skills, but also the subtle arts of encouragement, distraction, and emotional support that were crucial to successful birthing. Agnes knew how to help a frightened first-time mother find courage, how to guide an experienced mother through an unusually difficult labor, how to work with the family members, usually female relatives and neighbors, who gathered to support the birthing woman. The techniques available to medieval midwives were surprisingly sophisticated. Agnes understood the importance of cleanliness, washing her hands thoroughly and insisting on clean linens and instruments. She knew various positions that could help labor progress, from walking and squatting to using birthing stools that allowed gravity to assist delivery. Her knowledge of anatomy, though not formally trained, was often more practical and detailed than that of male physicians who were forbidden from examining women's bodies closely. When complications arose, as they inevitably did, Agnes had a repertoire of interventions that could save lives. She knew how to turn a breached baby, how to assist with difficult deliveries, how to control hemorrhaging after birth. Her herbal knowledge included powerful medicines like ergot, which could strengthen contractions and help expel the placenta, and other plants that could reduce bleeding or fight infection. But Agnes also understood the limits of her abilities and the importance of knowing when to seek help. In truly desperate situations, she might call for the services of a physician or even a priest if the situation seemed hopeless. She carried with her the knowledge of emergency procedures, including the ability to perform a primitive caesarean section if the mother had died, but the child might still be saved. A procedure that was sometimes successful in preserving infant life, even in the most tragic circumstances. The social role of the midwife extended far beyond the birthing chamber. Agnes served as a repository of knowledge about women's bodies and women's health throughout their lives. She understood the menstrual cycle, could diagnose and treat various gynecological conditions, and provided advice on fertility and contraception. Young women approaching marriage might consult her about what to expect in their married lives, while older women sought her help with the changes that came with age. This comprehensive understanding of women's health made midwives like Agnes essential to their communities in ways that went far beyond their role in childbirth. They were often the only healthcare providers available to women, and their knowledge encompassed everything from herbal remedies for common complaints to sophisticated understanding of psychological and emotional health. The legal and social status of midwives varied considerably across medieval Europe. In some regions, they were required to be licensed by church authorities or civic officials, a process that provided some official recognition, but also subjected them to oversight and potential persecution. In other areas, they practiced with the informal authority that came from community trust and demonstrated competence. The relationship between midwives and the church was particularly complex. On one hand, The Church recognized the essential nature of their work, and often required them to take oaths promising to provide help to all women regardless of their ability to pay. On the other hand, the intimate knowledge of women's bodies and the life and death nature of their work sometimes made church authorities suspicious of their practices and their loyalties. Agnes, like many midwives, navigated these tensions by maintaining careful orthodoxy in her public religious observances, while preserving traditional practices that might have pre-Christian origins. She would begin each birth with Christian prayers and invoke the protection of appropriate saints. But she also knew charms and techniques that had been passed down through generations of women and might contain echoes of much older traditions. The economics of midwifery were also complex. Midwives were typically paid in goods rather than money, grain, cloth, chickens, or other practical items that could sustain them and their families. Wealthy clients might provide more generous compensation, while poor families might pay very little or nothing at all. Most midwives, including Agnes, accepted this variable payment system as part of their calling, understanding that their services were too essential to be limited to those who could afford them. The training of new midwives was informal but intensive. Young women who showed aptitude and interest might serve as apprentices to established practitioners, gradually learning the skills and knowledge needed for independent practice. This training could take many years and included not just technical skills, but also the development of the judgment and emotional strength needed to handle the intense pressures of life and death situations. Agnes remembered her own training with the elderly midwife Beatrice, who had been practicing when Agnes was born, and who had guided her through her first tentative experiences with assisting births. Beatrice had been a demanding teacher, insisting on precision in herb preparation, gentleness in examination techniques, and calmness under pressure. She had also taught Agnes the importance of continuous learning, of paying attention to what worked and what didn't, of seeking out knowledge from other practitioners, of always being willing to try new approaches when traditional methods weren't sufficient. The psychological demands of midwifery were enormous. Agnes regularly dealt with situations where, despite her best efforts, mothers or babies died. She had to find ways to comfort grieving families while maintaining her own emotional equilibrium. She had to balance hope with realism, encouraging laboring women while honestly assessing their situations. She had to work with family members who might be panicked, critical, or interfering, all while concentrating on the medical and emotional needs of her patient. Yet the rewards of successful practice were equally profound. Agnes had brought hundreds of healthy babies into the world and helped countless women through the challenges of pregnancy and childbirth. She had been present at moments of profound joy and had played a crucial role in ensuring the continuation of families and communities. Her work connected her intimately with the fundamental rhythms of human existence: birth, growth, aging, and death. As the night wore on in the wool merchant's house, Agnes worked with quiet competence to guide the laboring woman through the final stages of birth. Her hands moved with practiced skill, her voice provided steady encouragement, and her presence offered the deep comfort that came from decades of experience with the mysteries of birth. When the baby finally emerged, healthy, crying, perfect, Agnes felt the satisfaction that never grew old, the profound joy of having facilitated one of life's most fundamental miracles. In the growing light of dawn, as Agnes cleaned and packed her instruments while the new mother rested with her baby, she embodied one of the most essential and enduring roles in human society. She was the keeper of ancient wisdom about birth and life, the guardian of knowledge that connected generations of women, the skilled practitioner who stood at the threshold between existence and non-existence, armed with nothing but experience, wisdom, and the fierce determination to bring new life safely into the world. The church bells of York were beginning to ring the morning prayers as Agnes made her way home through streets now bustling with early merchants and craftsmen. In her worn leather satchel, her instruments lay clean and ready for the next call, while in her heart, she carried the quiet satisfaction of another successful night's work in service of life itself. By the autumn of 1484, the world that had nurtured Agnes and countless women like her was beginning to change in ways that would echo through history. In the Rhine Valley, where golden leaves drifted down from ancient beech trees, a Dominican friar named Heinrich Kramer was putting the finishing touches on a manuscript that would unleash terror across Europe. The Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, would transform the wise women, herbalists, and midwives who had served their communities for generations into targets of suspicion, persecution, and death. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For centuries, the relationship between women healers and church authorities had been complex, but generally tolerant. Local priests often worked alongside village wise women, understanding that their services were essential to community survival. But as the medieval period waned and new religious and political pressures emerged, this delicate balance began to shift toward suspicion and fear. Margot lived through this transformation. A skilled herbalist in the Bavarian countryside, she had learned her craft from her grandmother and had practiced for nearly 20 years without incident. Her cottage garden produced the medicines that kept her village healthy, and her knowledge of childbirth had saved countless mothers and babies. But in the winter of 1487, everything changed. It began with whispers. A difficult birth that had required all of Margot's skills to save both mother and child was reinterpreted by some as evidence of supernatural intervention. Her successful treatment of a wasting illness that had puzzled the traveling physician became, in the retelling, proof of uncanny abilities. Her extensive knowledge of plants and their properties, once seen as admirable expertise, was now viewed with suspicion. How could any ordinary woman know so much about life and death unless she had made unholy bargains? The mechanisms of persecution were as systematic as they were cruel. The Malleus Maleficarum provided detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and executing suspected witches, and many of the characteristics it described matched exactly the skills and knowledge that had made women like Margot valuable to their communities. Knowledge of herbs, especially those that could cause harm as well as healing, was seen as evidence of malevolent intent. Success in treating difficult cases was interpreted as supernatural assistance. The very competence that had once earned respect now inspired fear. Understanding the historical context of the witch persecutions is crucial to understanding what happened to women's medical knowledge during this period. The late medieval and early modern periods were times of tremendous social upheaval. The Black Death had killed a third of Europe's population. Traditional social structures were being challenged by economic and political changes, and religious authorities were struggling to maintain control over increasingly diverse and questioning populations. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, women healers became convenient scapegoats. Their traditional knowledge, often passed down through generations, and including elements that predated Christianity, could be portrayed as evidence of forbidden practices. Their independence, their economic success, and their intimate knowledge of matters relating to birth, death, and sexuality made them targets for communities seeking simple explanations for complex problems. But the women didn't simply disappear. Instead, they adapted, went underground, and found new ways to preserve and transmit their knowledge. Margot, warned by friends about the growing suspicions surrounding her practice, made a decision that countless other women would make in the centuries that followed. She would continue her work, but she would do so in secret. The strategies women developed for survival were as ingenious as they were necessary. Knowledge that had once been openly shared was now whispered in private. passed from mother to daughter in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Herbal remedies were disguised as cooking ingredients or household preparations. Medical techniques were taught under the guise of ordinary domestic skills. Some women found protection by aligning themselves more closely with religious authorities. They emphasized the Christian elements of their practice, attributed their knowledge to divine inspiration rather than traditional learning, and worked to distance themselves from any practices that might be seen as suspiciously ancient or non-Christian. Others found safety in obscurity, practicing only for their immediate families or in remote rural areas where traditional ways were less likely to be challenged. The destruction of written records during this period was catastrophic for the preservation of women's medical knowledge. Many manuscripts containing remedies, techniques, and observations accumulated over generations were destroyed by their owners, who feared that possession of such materials could be used as evidence against them. Libraries and monasteries, once repositories of medical knowledge, purged their collections of texts that might be seen as dangerously unorthodox. Yet knowledge has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts at destruction. Women found creative ways to preserve essential information. Recipes for medicines were disguised as cooking instructions. Medical knowledge was encoded in songs, stories, and household traditions that could be passed down without arousing suspicion. Symbolic systems developed that allowed initiated practitioners to recognize each other and share information while maintaining the pretense of ordinary domestic life. Catherine, a midwife working in France during the height of the persecutions, developed an elaborate system for continuing her practice while avoiding detection. She maintained a public role as a respectable widow who helped her neighbors with ordinary household tasks, preserving food, preparing herbal teas for minor ailments, offering comfort to new mothers. But beneath this conventional surface, she continued to practice sophisticated midwifery, using her network of female friends and relatives to identify women who needed her services and to arrange discreet consultations. Her knowledge didn't disappear. It simply became invisible to authorities who were looking for obvious signs of nonconformity. She taught young women practical skills that happened to include medical knowledge. How to prepare strengthening broths for new mothers that contained specific herbs to prevent hemorrhaging. How to make soothing teas for fretful babies that incorporated gentle sedatives and digestive aids. How to treat household injuries using the same wound-healing techniques she had once applied openly. The psychological impact of the persecutions on practicing women healers was profound. Many experienced what we might now recognize as a form of trauma, constantly vigilant for signs of suspicion, carefully moderating their behavior and their claims about their abilities. The confidence and authority that had once characterized women, like Agnes the midwife, was replaced by caution and self-doubt. Knowledge that had once been a source of pride and community recognition became a dangerous secret that could lead to torture and death. But even under these terrible pressures, the tradition of women's healing knowledge refused to die. In hidden corners of society, among groups of women friends, within extended families, in remote rural communities, the accumulated wisdom of generations continued to be practiced and preserved. These underground networks of knowledge became one of the most important means by which traditional medicine survived the transition to the modern era. The long-term consequences of the witch persecutions for medical knowledge were devastating. Centuries of accumulated empirical observation, sophisticated understanding of plant medicines, and refined techniques for treating illness and assisting childbirth were lost. The suppression of women's medical practice created gaps in healthcare that wouldn't be filled for generations, if ever. Yet the story isn't entirely one of loss and destruction. The women who survived, who adapted, who found ways to preserve their knowledge under impossible circumstances, demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity. They developed new forms of practice that were less visible, but often no less effective. They created networks of mutual support that sustained both knowledge and practitioners through the darkest periods of persecution. The integration of women's traditional knowledge with emerging academic medicine also continued, though in more subtle and less acknowledged ways. Male physicians, despite their official dismissal of women's healing practices, often relied on traditional remedies and techniques that they had learned from female practitioners. The boundary between legitimate medicine and folk healing was never as clear as official pronouncements suggested. Some regions and communities were more resistant to the persecution of women healers than others. In areas where traditional practices were deeply integrated into community life, where local authorities were more tolerant, or where women had found ways to align their practice with accepted religious and social norms, the tradition of women's medicine continued with less disruption. The story of Anna, a wise woman practicing in a remote alpine valley, illustrates how geography and community solidarity could provide protection. Her village was isolated enough that outside authorities rarely visited, and local religious and civil leaders understood the essential nature of her services. When rumors of witch hunting reached their valley, the entire community closed ranks to protect her, creating stories about her Christian devotion and charitable works that deflected suspicion. Anna's practice continued much as it had for generations, but she adapted her public presentation to minimize risk. She emphasized prayer and divine guidance in her healing work, spoke of her knowledge as God-given rather than learned, and made sure to attend church services regularly and visibly. These adaptations allowed her to continue serving her community while avoiding the fate that befell so many of her counterparts in more accessible regions. The underground preservation of women's medical knowledge during the persecution period created a parallel tradition that would eventually resurface in different forms. Folk medicine, traditional healing practices, and herbalism survived the centuries of suppression partly because women found ways to embed essential knowledge in seemingly ordinary domestic activities. The recipes that grandmothers passed to granddaughters often contained sophisticated medical knowledge disguised as cooking instructions. The household remedies that mothers taught their daughters frequently incorporated complex understanding of plant properties and human physiology. The customs and traditions that seemed like mere folklore often preserved crucial information about health, healing, and the prevention of illness. As the darkest period of the persecutions began to wane, these underground streams of knowledge gradually began to resurface. Women continued to practice traditional medicine, but now they did so within more restricted spheres, primarily focused on their own families and immediate communities, often without claiming the broader authority that their predecessors had enjoyed. The resilience of women's medical knowledge through this period of persecution speaks to something fundamental about the human need for healing and the power of accumulated wisdom.